Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Matthew Brogdon, and I've got a special guest today. Dan DiSalvo is joining us from the City College of New York. Dan is a scholar of American politics, American public policy, American political thought, and he's come to chat with us today about political parties in the United States. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be with you, Matthew.
Political parties in America have undergone quite a sort of roller coaster ride. Thomas Jefferson said about political parties that if he could only go to heaven with a political party, he'd just rather not go. Then I think if we fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, one of the most important thinkers about political parties, E.E. Schattschneider, big mouthful, said that it was impossible to conceive of democracy save with political parties. So that seems like quite a disparity. I mean, parties have gone from being sort of persona non grata among the founding generation to being an indispensable part of modern liberal democracy. So help me understand why the founding generation is so antithetical or feels such antipathy toward this.
Yeah, it wasn't just Jefferson that was opposed to political parties, although Jefferson's opposition didn't last very long. And you could say that maybe his statement shows that many statements in politics are in bad faith, since he hoped still to go to heaven, even though he was one of the founders of the first political party, the Republican Party at the time, or sometimes called the Democratic Republicans. So in that sense, it wasn't just Jefferson. It was also probably Madison, John Adams, George Washington. So one reading any of the writings and speeches of many of the founders would come across all these statements condemning political parties, worrying about political parties, thinking that they were something that was going to be detrimental to American constitutional government. The truth is, of course, that not long on the heels, in fact, by the 1790s, Jefferson and Madison and others and Hamilton are hard at work building political parties, and we go on to have many different incarnations of parties in American politics that we can talk about. I think part of the issue is that what they found is that even though parties are nowhere mentioned really in the Constitution, is that the Constitution, which sets up all these institutions, the executive branch, the presidency, Congress, the House and Senate, and the judiciary, doesn't specify a way that these offices that it creates are going to get filled up. How are you going to get people to be elected to these offices? How are these people going to campaign? How are these people going to present themselves for office? We know the number of people who would like to be in Congress, right, and get down to a manageable number. None of that is spelled out in the Constitution. So it's in those gaps that parties come to play this essential role of, you could say, if the Constitution is sort of the skeleton and the vertebrae of our political system, the parties become the ligaments and the muscles that tie it together, tying citizens to the institutions set up by the Constitution.
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it, because we usually think of the Constitution as establishing a mode of selection, because in the case of the House of Representatives, it's specified that members of the House of Representatives would be chosen by the people. So we think, well, you've got an office. You've got qualifications for that office. So we've said you got to be such and such an age and, a citizen for so many years. And then you've said who's going to choose them. You establish a constituency. The people are going to select members of the House. It's easy to miss just how much of our actual sort of system for selecting someone who holds office is missing in that. I guess I think about how thick the institutional environment is for elections now. We elect a member of Congress. There's a whole set of stepping stones to even become sort of a candidate, right? Figure out who's really in contention for a seat in Congress and who do they need to impress, right? Whose Rolodex, we would have said some time ago, do they need to get their name on a ballot? So the Constitution doesn't really answer that many questions for us. So how did political parties fix that problem?
Well, partly it's also important, just building on the point you just made, important to remember the founders didn't totally overlook this. They were in part assuming that, and which is true up until today, that state governments are going to be the primary actors in figuring out the electoral rules between the qualifications for office and the constituency, the people. Well, ballot access rules, how voting is going to occur, the kind of ballots, all of those decisions were, and to a large extent still are, the province of state governments, right? So that was what was going to figure these things out, because in part, American politics and American government at the time of the founding, and really all the way until, one could argue, even the 1930s, was enormously decentralized, where state and local government was really where the action was, much more than the national government. So I think that's an important part. But so parties really get going as helping, you could say, or to figure out what exactly are going to be these mechanisms for nominating candidates for office. After George Washington's election, well, a lot of people would have liked, even at that time, ambitious politicians wanted to be president. Well, how are we going to sort out who should be the candidates for president that the voters can pick from? There's no process that's specified in the Constitution. There's this process of the Electoral College, where the Electoral College would be this deliberative body that would sort of take into account what the people wanted and then make a choice. But again, that only worked, you could say, the way that it's designed in the Constitution for 2 elections, Washington's election and re-election. And then after that, they said, well, we need to figure out a new process. And the process for electing presidents became what was then called the King Caucus, which was what were these nascent parties in Congress. People would get together and say, well, we think it should be this person. We think it should be that person, but it didn't have any constitutional status. People worried that it was violating separation of powers because now it sort of looks like the Congress is having a substantial say in who's going to be president, more like a parliamentary system. So that doesn't seem to square. So it's in this very slow working out process of what the parties are and should be, partly at the state and local government, partly at the national level, especially related to the presidency.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up King Caucus because it's a complex sort of episode in our history and isn't intuitive, but it is the first example of sort of party-based process. The party as an institution displacing some part of the constitutional structure. Maybe it'd be good to dive into that for just a second, because my understanding of King Caucus, you basically have the parties in Congress. So you developed a caucus, the gathering of the members of the party. And because by 1816, the Federalist Party has more or less died. I mean, it's really diminishing in power. Jeffersonian Republicans are, they're the 800-pound gorilla of American politics by that time. My impression is, maybe I'm right about this, the national level Federalists are sort of out of the contest in a substantial way. So that means whoever Jeffersonian Republicans pick in this party caucus in Congress, which I think at one point, Jefferson even presided over the Republican caucus in Congress. So Jeffersonian Republicans in Congress would get together. The president would actually meet with them, and whoever they selected was destined to become president. So literally, Congress was picking the president because it was a foregone conclusion, whoever the caucus picked. And I think there's actually a protest that comes out of Tennessee? There's a famous protest comes out arguing that, look, the framers of the Constitution very emphatically put the selection of the president somewhere other than Congress because, Congress picking the president was the worst possible sort of outcome in terms of presidential selection. And here you're using this political party system sort of undermine that whole separation of powers.
I think it's important to consider, too, the status of thinking about what political parties are and the legitimacy of parties as a whole. We started on this point of Jefferson saying that parties are, and many of the other founders, Washington's farewell address, thinking that there's something illegitimate or bad about political parties. If we look back at Jefferson and Madison's efforts to create the Republican Party, how did they conceive of this party? They said, look, we want to get back to a nonpartisan system. We don't want parties, but Hamilton, their great adversary, or Jefferson's great adversary, he's creating a party, and he has all these other Federalists and people who closet monarchists, and they're not really on board with liberal democracy, or they're just bad. And we've got to defeat them. And the only way we can defeat them is by creating a political party. But this political party is going to be a party to end all parties, meaning it's not really legitimate. It's only for this one-time purpose until everyone is converted to the cause of American liberal democracy properly understood, i.e. understood in the way Jefferson and Madison think they should think about it. Then the party can go away, it can wither away. And that was really, in some ways, you could say by the time we get to 1816, the Federalists had sort of shot themselves in the foot and maybe to some extent showed their colors that they had not fully adapted to the new dispensation of American liberal democracy. You end up with what's then called the era of good feelings, which is we don't need this party anymore because we're all of the same mindset. We're all thinking there's a broad consensus or national unity government is what we would hear about today. A national unity government, that's what we would have. But this problem of selecting candidates, as you suggested, still persists. And that's where someone like Martin Van Buren, who later becomes president, but comes out of party politics in New York State, and his nickname was the Little Magician, but becomes one of these people in the 1820s that starts thinking about, look, this King Caucus is not fully legitimate, and many people are worried about its constitutional status. This idea that the parties are going to wither away is potentially dangerous, especially because if they wither away, what's going to replace them is going to be divisions not between parties, but between sections, between North and South over slavery. And that threatens a potential civil war. That we want to avoid. So Van Buren's argument is we need to try to knit the party together with party competition. That's actually going to be new kinds of parties that are going to persist. They're not going to be parties to end all parties like Jefferson's idea. They're going to be parties that are going to alternate in power. And it's a new conception of parties where opposing the party in power is no longer seen as potentially treasonous or seditious. We think back to the Alien and Sedition Acts under President Adams. But these parties are going to have a kind of legitimacy even in opposing the current administration.
Help me understand why Van Buren would think political parties are a solution to sectionalism. You're saying that slavery is becoming an increasingly divisive wedge. The country's sort of dividing into slave and free because this has a geographical representation in terms of North and South. That's sort of the natural factional makeup of the United States. How do political parties solve that problem?
Well, in Van Buren's idea, it's going to be he uses this phrase in this famous letter to a Richmond newspaper editor, they're going to knit the country together because inside each party isn't going to be the Northern Party or the Southern Party. That's what he wants to avoid. They're going to be what becomes the Whigs and the Democrats. But they're going to have members and they're going to find ways to appeal to people in the South and in the North. So there's going to be Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And they're going to kind of negotiate to keep slavery mostly off the agenda. Right? And there's going to be Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs because they're going to play out on a different set of issue agendas and a little bit by putting people from both regions in each party, that's going to in some ways let them prudentially navigate and negotiate this very complex question of slavery in the nation. And that's Van Buren's idea. His other way of helping to do this is institutional, is we're going to get rid of this King Caucus, and we're going to have this idea of national conventions. The conventions are going to have delegates come to nominate presidential candidates from each state party, and that's going to be the site where they can get together and negotiate. The Northerners and the Southerners, before the internet and telephone and radio, they're going to come to these conventions and meet, and that's going to be their chance to work out their differences, figure out what their agenda is going to be in a way that's not right at the point of legislation. It's not meeting in Congress, section against section. It's meeting in this convention, ironing out differences within the party itself. And it's going to add this new, you could say, again, not specified in the Constitution, but new power center, which is this party that's going to come into being every 4 years at these conventions from different parts. And these state party leaders are going to become important political actors, even if they're not elected to any official government position.
So in order for that to succeed, to get a national Democratic Party and a national Whig Party, which are the two that we wind up with in that period, and to keep those from dividing along the sectional difference over slavery, there have to be issues in play, other issues that can somehow outweigh slavery. What is it that they find? Maybe it helped to think about some concrete examples. What issues could Van Buren come up with to say Democrats are about this and it transcends slavery? And Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, we're in the same party because we want the same outcomes on these policy issues. And to achieve that, we've got to push slavery to the side, right? Keep that off of Congress's agenda, keep it out of the presidential election, and instead focus on this other thing. So what are the other issues that can possibly counterbalance or outweigh slavery as an issue in American politics at that point?
In a word that's become much more part of our recent vocabulary, the tariff. The tariff is the main revenue mechanism for the national government. This is before the income tax. Now, the tariff obviously affected different economic interests differently. So in the southern agricultural states, which were primarily producing cotton and indigo, tobacco, that was the locus of opposition to the tariff. There was a more free market principle on the Republican side, but there were still obviously lots of farmers in New England who also wanted to sell their goods on international markets and did not want retaliatory tariffs, especially in Britain and elsewhere. So they might find common cause. They say, we don't want this powerful federal government managing this tariff system. And we're in the North, and well, we might not think so much of slavery, but we see a common interest because there were still tobacco farmers in Connecticut.
Right. What about the other way around? Where were the Whigs?
You're with the Whigs
that wanted the tariffs in the South.
Well, think about Southern, again, a small portion, but there's still Southern manufacturers, small Southern retailers that would be retailing tools and equipment. Well, they might want to say, well, look, we can be charging a premium to sell shovels made in America rather than to buy the British shovels. So we're more respectful, and we want to develop a Southern, increase our ability to manufacture goods in the South. How are we going to do that? The other piece of the Whig program led by Henry Clay.
Kind of a Westerner / Southerner, right?
Which shows exactly how to knit these things. Clay is a perfect in-between person to announce this policy of what was called internal improvements. The federal government is going to use this tariff revenue to improve dredging rivers, improving harbors, creating roadways, and helping to finance all those, knitting the nation together with a system of roads and canals, and that's going to facilitate commerce. So anybody in the South that is not in the plantation and agricultural industry, anybody outside of that might see some benefit to the Whig program, and that's going to obviously tie them to manufacturing and financial interests, which were obviously bigger in the Northeast.
Okay, that's a great explanation. And then we're going to add the West into all that. So we'll leave that out for now. Right. We have westward expansion, so that's going to make things much more complicated than North and South eventually. Okay, so political parties come along. We've seen at least some of the things that they do at this point. They help us manage this candidate selection system, how we're going to figure out who's running for office and sort of who's going to climb the ladder into the next open congressional seat. People like Van Buren and Henry Clay helps them transcend slavery and keep that off the national agenda so we can stave off civil war and instead fight over more mundane policy stuff and economics. So it lowers the temperature, it sounds like, in American politics in some ways.
Well, perhaps not. I don't want to brush over this issue of slavery too quickly because it's obviously, a huge issue of justice, which is to say that the parties, in some sense, are suppressing a choice over a huge historical injustice. Now, one can argue that this is the Van Buren position. This is prudential. We're going to end up with a bloody civil war if we don't have that. And truth be told, that's what happens about 40 years later in 1860, is the country does decide to confront slavery. Would it have been better or less violent or less bloody if it had occurred in the 1820s? Oh, I don't know. But it is suppressing an intense issue. And it's also pushing outside of party politics the abolitionist movement. So if you think of the abolitionist movement is pushing away from the party system because this is the most important issue of the day and we can't get at a hearing through the current party system, and perhaps radicalizes the abolitionist movement. The famous statement of one of its leaders, William Lloyd Garrison, is that the Constitution is a pact with the devil because it protects slavery. And so getting a hearing for that position, at least in the halls of Congress, is partly suppressed by the party system. So this is a little bit of perhaps parties as trumping morality a little bit.
Even constitutional rights, because there's the petition controversy in Congress in the 1830s. I guess it was both houses of Congress, I think House and Senate, have a standing rule that if any petition comes into Congress, was it on the subject of slavery or only arguing abolition?
I think it was on the subject.
Just on the subject of slavery. Any petition on the subject of slavery would immediately be tabled. The Congress would not have the petition read. And this was, some argued, including John Quincy Adams, a direct violation of the First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Yeah.
If the people have a right to petition, then Congress has an obligation to read it. Quite interesting. Of course, we do also know political parties, the two-party system does not successfully stave off slavery. Eventually, it becomes a big enough issue that all those abolitionists and others have been pushed outside and do manage to build the only successful third party in American constitutional history. I think you made this observation when we were talking with some undergraduates during your visit, that the Republican Party that Lincoln builds is the only successful third party to elbow its way into the party system and become a majority party.
In the narrow and I mean, you could say there's been lots of successful third parties, but depending on the criteria of success, but successful in the sense of getting into the system at the national level and supplanting one of the existing parties, in this case, the Whig Party, which had itself fractured over the question of slavery, since between the time we were talking about in the 1820s with Martin Van Buren up to the 1850s, the issue that you also mentioned of westward expansion. What's going to happen when these new states come in? Congress in the 1820s had passed the Missouri Compromise, but is the Missouri Compromise holding? And the controversy over slavery really fractures the Whig Party. It tears apart those northern and southern knitting together. And the Republican Party really comes into being as mostly a party of some of the westward expansion and the North. And ultimately, in that sense, divides along sectional lines and then leads to the effort to secede by the southern states.
So eventually, the two-party system Van Buren creates to avoid sectional division becomes a vehicle for sectional division.
Just ultimately cannot stave off these sectional divisions. Much also happens between the 1820s and 1850s in terms of changes in the southern economy and the southern slaveholding population growing, and a radicalization on both sides, in some ways outside the party system. We've already mentioned the abolitionists, but even in the South by the 1850s, you had a group called the Fire Breathers, whose policy position was to reopen the transatlantic slave trade. So a real radicalization that the party system just could no longer contain.
Yeah, you mentioned that one definition of success for a third party would be becoming one of the two majority parties. I guess the other definition of success would be just ruining someone else's electoral chances, right? Being a spoiler. That's the other definition. I kept that lowlife out of office.
Well, that's certainly been a role that has been played by third parties, often being the vehicle for the presidential aspirations of one person. But even if you think about a successful third party would be, say, the Progressive Party of the late 19th century, which in some ways is co-opted by the Democratic Party of William Jennings Bryan, but had elected people under its label to Congress, and it sort of reshaped the Democrats' policy positions and really had a large impact on the political system in different ways. You could see the Progressive Party as reconfiguring the Democratic Party's policy positions and agenda in important ways as an example of success.
I guess you become a center of gravity, so you sort of pull one of the parties in a different direction than they'd otherwise go. We've walked through a bit of a saga at this point of starting out with, Jefferson and Madison building an opposition party, Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. I just want to put every good term in there. You know? It's like the Freedom and Liberty Party or something. In opposition to Hamilton's Federalists. The Federalists die, we get the era of good feelings, and then we get sometime around the 1820s, the remaining political coalition sort of turns into Democrats, Jacksonian Democrats, and Whigs. And that persists for 30 or so years until the Whig Party dies away in sectional controversy over slavery, and we get the Republican Party. And Democrats and Republicans manage to weather the Civil War and come out the other end still intact as the two principal political parties in our system, and have remained so. So American politics is a two-party system. So I think it'd probably be helpful for us to tackle that question. Why is American politics a two-party system? Because that's not the only way you can do political parties. What are some of the alternatives?
Well, I mean, on the two-party question, if we're still staying far back in time, there used to be a famous observation by a great political scientist named Nelson Polsby that we actually had 102 parties, assuming 50 states, because even though they all had the same names, Democrats and Republicans, the Democrats and the Republicans, say, of where we are here in Utah, are not the same as the Democrats and Republicans in my home state of New York. And they would have probably been even more different if we went back 50 years. And then you'd have the two national parties. So that gives you 2 per 50 for states plus the national. And that shows that there was much more diversity in the federal system. But if you think about why is there only 2 parties per state or only 2 parties in the country, the biggest 2 reasons are the electoral rules, which is what are sometimes called by political scientists first past the post or winner take all elections, or another term is plurality elections. What do any of those terms pointing at or mean? It just means that whoever gets the most votes for an election wins, and you're only competing for 1 seat per district. So in that sense, if we have 3 candidates in a race, two could each get 30%, and the person who got 40% would win. But the other two obviously would have a next incentive to combine their forces in the next election. And the next election, we have a two-party system, and that combination is presumably only going to win 60-40.
So does that make a two-party system kind of inevitable in that context?
Well, that's been one of the strong things. First past the post systems are much closer. Now, there are other electoral rules that states can and do adopt that facilitate the creation of second or third parties or other parties. In my home state of New York has a curious system called fusion voting, which is other parties can cross-endorse major parties, and if they get a sufficient number of votes, they can continue to remain on the ballot. So in New York State and local elections, we have the Working Families Party on the left that, say, cross-endorses the Democratic candidate, and then voters would like to indicate that they'd like to move the Democratic Party further to the left, vote for the Democratic candidate on the Working Families Party line.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So they sort of adopt the Democratic Party candidate.
Exactly.
Impute their label.
To it. Right. And then
that is very interesting.
And then that allows the party to also exist for city council elections in New York City. A number of city council members are Working Families Party members. So a lot of this is getting us at these first past the post issue is the key driver of the two-party system. Now that can be weakened by other electoral laws in state and local government. The other big driver of the two-party system is the Electoral College, because that same winner-take-all system applies to Electoral College votes in every state except for Maine and Nebraska, which means whoever wins the most votes in a given state wins all the Electoral College votes. The classic example here is Ross Perot. Ran as a Reform Party candidate in 1992 election against Bill Clinton for the Democrats and George H.W. Bush for the Republicans. Perot received 20% of the popular vote. Strong showing for a novice politician, but he won 0 Electoral College votes. Why? Because in every state, either Bush or Clinton won more votes than Perot did, so they were always scooping up all the Electoral College votes. So that Electoral College system makes it very hard for third parties to get in. In addition, the last feature is states controlling voting means for third parties to get on the ballot in all 50 states is often very expensive and difficult. So take the example of Ralph Nader's campaign for the presidency in 2000, which did have a big impact. Nader spent almost all of his campaign war chest fighting legal battles against the Democrats to get his name on the ballot in all 50 states, because the Democrats were worried, which ultimately did happen, that Nader would suck off votes from their candidate, Al Gore, and he would lose to George W. Bush. So again, this Electoral College dynamics are also a powerful enforcer of a two-party system.
Now, everything you've described in terms of enforcing the two-party system are all creatures of state law, as far as I can tell.
With the exception of the Electoral College.
That is true. You could argue the Electoral College sort of demands institutionally a decisive outcome in terms of one candidate, a clear majoritarian outcome, and that sort of pushes states to adopt some kind of first past the post system. But it also doesn't require it. I mean, there's nothing actually to stop states from adopting a more pluralistic, multi-party approach to Electoral College delegates. I know a lot of people would like to see some sort of, proportional vote mechanism. You get whatever percentage of the state's electoral votes your party's represented by, and then you could divide New York and Texas. They wouldn't just have to go Democratic and Republican. Could divvy them up, and then maybe other parties could. So the Constitution itself has some built-in inertia that suggests a two-party system, particularly with the presidency, just because you want decisive elections. But states are technically free to structure the selection of members of Congress as they wish, as long as they're picked by the people. The particular mechanism you use for candidate selection or picking the people who occupy the seats are all left up to states, and the allotment of Electoral College votes. So, and even ballot rules like you're talking about, allowing other parties outside the two major parties to participate, are all within the power of states to do, but we've made the judgment not to. That indicates to me that there's a sort of collective American judgment. I mean, 50 separate states in the District of Columbia have all chosen to have these majoritarian systems that reinforce the two-party system. So what's so great about the two-party system that everyone would just follow Martin Van Buren's lead for 180 years now and go this route?
Well, I think one way to think about this question is how might we characterize our two-party system? It's easy to think about some counterexamples. One might say about our two-party system is we have two big parties, but they're relatively weak parties in governing terms. And we'll unpack what that means. Whereas you can contrast our system with England, or Great Britain, what's sometimes called the Westminster model, has two big parties primarily, the Tories and Labour Party, or Conservative and Labour in Britain. And those are two big parties, but they're strong. Okay. And then you can think about systems, say in continental Europe, of multi-party systems that have relatively strong parties. So what are the differences across these three different models? Well, let's take the British example. The parties there are strong because the parties can campaign on a clear platform, and then when they are elected in the majoritarian House of Commons, they can pretty much run the table, right? They can pass what they want. The opposition can complain and say it's bad policy and set themselves up for the next election, but they can't really stop it. And then when you arrive at the next election, the public can make a judgment and say, well, did things go well or poorly? And they know who to blame. They can say, well, this was the Labour Party government's policies for the last few years, and things are terrible. The economy's not going well. We want to elect the Conservatives, or vice versa. In the American case, the parties can campaign on things, but the party as an organization often doesn't have a coherent message because all these different candidates from all over the country are slightly running on their own message. They get to make up their own campaign talking points. They're not running on the party program, partly because in the British case, the party picks the candidates rather than the candidates putting themselves forward. In our system, you campaign inside your own party to win a primary election. Then you campaign on what you think is good. It's much more individual centered. So out of this cacophony of voices, you could say something like the Democratic or Republican Party program emerges. But even if that party is elected and wins the presidency, the House, and the Senate, which doesn't happen that often, to still pass major legislation, they're going to need the support of the other party. So at the end of 2 years, before there's a midterm election, which comes up quickly, so there's all these staggered elections, it's very hard for the public to say, well, who exactly is fully responsible for the way the country has gone? We often look to whoever the president's party is, but major laws often are the responsibility of both parties. Just one historical example of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Many people say, well, that was the Democrats' bill because Johnson was president and he did do a great deal to push it through. But where did the majority of the votes in the House come from? The Republican Party. So the Republican Party doesn't get any credit anymore for passing the 64 Civil Rights Act, but it wouldn't have passed without the Republicans because the Democrats were internally divided. So this gets us at this question of big and strong, big and weak, and then the multi-party system. We can talk more about that if you want.
So
it's another
so in the American case, I mean, what it sounds like we're describing is that unlike the responsible party model where somebody wins a majority, no matter how slim in the UK, they get to pass their platform. The American system, because of separation of powers, because of our sort of strong institutional system of a bicameral legislature and a separate executive that resists sort of party control, you actually have to have a kind of consensus legislation. You got to have a pretty big tent policy to actually get it passed. The social science on this, right? The most prominent studies, which would come from like Francis Lee, I think, folks like that would say, well, there is no such thing as major policy change that happens in American politics without bipartisan support. I mean, there might be some very narrow exceptions to that, but major policies that actually stick, that aren't just ephemeral, and that have a real impact, even if you have unified government, even if the president and both houses of Congress are controlled by the same political party, you still typically need votes from the other side of the aisle in significant numbers to get a policy that will actually stick and change the country's direction in a significant way. So that means the American system really puts a lot of emphasis on pluralism and a kind of consensus politics if you want to accomplish big things.
Yeah, and that goes back, you could say, to the original constitutional design. And in some ways, you could say it was designed to be against political parties in that sense that the check on government power was to come from the separation of powers system that would force people to compromise and arrive at some kind of broad consensus. That is, the separate institutions sharing powers of the Madisonian system would force this kind of pretty broad societal consensus, or at least among the political establishment, in order for major legislation to occur. So, as you mentioned, there's a lot of political science research, in the modern era demonstrating this point, going back to classic books by a Yale political scientist named David Mayhew. And you mentioned Francis Lee's more recent work that kind of extends Mayhew's original finding, that he had a book, it had a great title. It was called Divided We Govern, which showed that even in situations of divided government where one party controlled, say, the presidency and the other controlled Congress or one chamber of Congress, just as much, in Mayhew's finding, just as much major legislation, stuff that was going to have major policy impact, it was going to be durable, had all these other qualities, was as likely to occur under divided government as under unified government. And in some ways, it showed that you still needed this big consensus for things. That doesn't mean there aren't some major laws that are totally partisan laws, say Obamacare, right? Would be in one example from the Democratic side in recent years, or the Trump tax cuts in 2017, fully only voted for by the Republicans, totally opposed by the Democrats. And in our current polarized environment, we do see a slight uptick in the number of big, important laws passed on a partisan basis. But lots of big legislation still going through that's bipartisan. Even some of the things under President Biden had pretty big and substantial Republican support.
And certainly something like immigration reform or some of the other large objectives that folks would like to see, that the public certainly seems to be in a mood to see, are going to require that kind of consensus building. I was going to ask you one more question. To think of what it was. So it sounds like in our description of the way that political parties are functioning in the American constitutional system, political parties are always sort of straining against separation of powers, checks and balances, sort of our constitutional structures, because, the party system is built to win the game. It assembles all the pieces and tries to assemble a winning coalition so that it can win the game. And all of these divisions built into the separation of powers, all these strong institutions that are sitting around and whose help you need to get these kinds of policy outcomes, are sort of standing in the way of the kind of unified, decisive action that political parties really aim at getting. Maybe in conclusion, you could help us understand. So maybe you've got a way of capturing this move from parties being inimical to constitutional government, maybe posing a sort of threat, to being such an indispensable part of the way that things work. I mean, after all, there is no example of a liberal democracy that doesn't have a party system. It can be structured differently. They've all got them. I guess what's the best encapsulation of the rationale for what political parties do in American politics now?
Yeah, I think this goes back to one of the initial quotes that we started with, this famous political scientist, E.E. Schatzsnyder. And the argument here is that in our system, Schatzsnyder had a great phrase for it, the people are semi-sovereign. They're not fully sovereign. They don't vote directly on laws. They vote for people, representatives who are going to then decide, make those decisions, vote on laws and govern. And the argument here is that the mass of the people needs some way of doing some of the things we've been talking about, winnowing down the number of candidates, developing a platform, a set of policy alternatives that the government should pursue, that then give at least a patina of responsibility, of democratic accountability. We sent you to Congress to pursue X, and did you do that or not? And we can try to hold you accountable for that. And it's parties that really create those two-way forms of communications that can do that. Now, are they always performing some of these functions well? Maybe not. You could say that this friction with our constitutional system, which is in some ways hostile to political parties, does it sometimes push the parties to become too weak to govern effectively and to do, you could say, the things that we just described, selecting candidates in a way that facilitates democratic deliberation? Or does it just encourage tribal passions, right? So the Constitution can act negatively on the parties, which can make the political system perhaps not work as well. Or the parties can become themselves perhaps too powerful and try and override the constitutional strictures, right? The Constitution is trying to divide and disperse power, and the parties are trying to assemble it and pull it together so that they can, as you suggested, act more decisively. So maybe the parties themselves then push against the Constitution. So there's You could say this constant back and forth in our system between one side getting the better of the other too much. And, balance between the two would be ideal, but that's hard to strike.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate all the insight into the way that political parties work in our system. Thanks for visiting the center.
It's my pleasure.